Hello everyone, this is Royale Miniatures here with another paint tutorial. In this video we're going to go over how to make your own custom sword decals for your models. And adding swords to certain elements of your model's armor is a pretty common theme that a lot of people have asked me to do. So I wanted to show you how you can do this yourself without having to go through aligning up decals on your model. And I find that it's actually pretty easy to use paint in these areas because it actually just comes down to using just a couple series of well-placed lines because the model is so small. And I'm going to be putting the first series of swords on the model's shoulder patch here, and I'll be using white paint. And what I've done here, and you can see that the paint is coming down fairly thin, and I want to ensure that I'm just using enough paint in the center of the sword, and I'll gradually draw the paint out here, and I'm kind of sizing up where the sword is relative to the shoulder plate armor here, and I'm going to gradually build out and expand from that initial line. And one very important key when you're doing this method is to make sure that your paint is relatively watered down, otherwise it will be too thick. And as I now move on to the next set of lines, I'm going to be working on the hilt, and it's a very simple process where I just do one line for the main part of the hilt, and then I'll branch out from there with just one line on the border. So I just keep it really simple at this stage, and essentially what I'm preparing to do is to just have enough paint on each part of these elements where I'll then be making a really nice border for the colors that the person had asked for. And in this case, I'll be using a red and a black. And I will now be moving on to the knee pads, and I'm going to be following the exact same formula that I had used to make the initial swords on the armor patch. And in this case, it's very tricky because it's a much smaller surface, so we're already working fairly small on that shoulder patch, but now I'm going to be working even smaller on the knee pad armor, so I'm going to be very meticulous with where I put my lines. And now that I have both the swords done on the shoulder plate, I'm ready to move on to adding the colors on each sword. Now, this is going to be a little bit tricky because there are two colors on each sword. Normally, if it was the same color and it was just a pair of crossed swords, I would be a little bit more cavalier about how I would apply paint on these areas, but I'm going to be very calculating, and I'm going to make sure to preserve the border between each sword in addition to ensuring that I want the paint to really have a nice point on each tip of the sword. That's a really important way to use your paint and really control how it is on your brush, because you want to ensure that when someone looks closely at your model, they'll still see a really nice fine point on those tips. And I find that that's really cool to have that preserved when you're making your swords on your models, because adding that extra little bit of time to get a really fine point really makes a difference. And you can see here that I'm being very careful with where I have the paint enter on the model's surface, and then I'll make sure to carry that and draw it back to really make a nice preserved point. And working on these lines at the hilt is extremely challenging, and I'll be really sure to dilute the paint. So you can see here, this is just barely one brush stroke, and I'm being extremely careful not to have any of that paint leach over that nice white border outline that we had made earlier. So, and I will also make sure that all those lines interconnect, so there is a very clear distinction on how that sword is one solid piece. And I'm going to move on now to the knee pads, and you can see here that I'm going to be very careful. Once again, it is the smallest little details and adding just the smallest movements here when it comes down to making these kind of adjustments on your own custom decals. And especially here on the base, you can see that even though I was able to get those very fine lines, I'm going to be even diluting it even more because I just don't want to risk losing anything. And you can see here that with my fingers being really tightly controlled and having good technique, I'm able to really preserve that area and ensure that there is no overlap of paint. And I'll do a little bit of touch up here and there, but on the same token, I will now be going over to the next part of the decal where I'll be making the black from the sword that goes underneath. And they requested a red sword and a black sword interacting together, and I also have a black sword on the knee pad as well. So I'm going to be using the exact same technique here where I'll be having the brush bristles aligning right in the middle of that white path that we had made earlier, and I'll be really making sure that the black paint is keeping that really clear and crisp line. And especially in this case, because these colors are polar opposites, I want to make sure that they don't have any bleed through or have that break that barrier. So I'm going to be very careful with how I apply the paint here. And you can see here that on these areas, once again, I'm making sure that that line is faint enough that it does not break the border, but I also want it to be very clearly defined. So I will go back and make sure that the black is strong in these areas, because even if you are applying paint in a very, very limited area, you want to make sure that it is the color fully covering that area and not just a brush pass. Because yes, you can do a brush pass, and yes, it will be very small, but ensure that you're getting full coverage in these areas. And especially here where the black sword interacts with the red sword, I really want to make sure that the border is preserved, but I also want to ensure that I'm getting just close enough so that detail is preserved. And this is where I'm being extremely careful. I'm just barely creeping the brush over here, and I really want to make sure that I don't ruin that white border that we had taken so much time to prepare. And now that I'm taking a look, I'm really happy with how that turned out. It was very challenging, and I'm ready to move on now to the knee pad here. I'm going to be using the exact same technique that I had used on the red sword on the opposite knee pad, where I'm going to be stabilizing with 2 fingers, one on the model, one on the brush, and then I'll have the other 2 fingers holding the brush, so I'm just barely dragging the tip there and making sure that that line is as accurate as possible. And especially here on the hilt, I'm making sure that I'm just barely applying any pressure, and then I compare it with the other side, and once I'm happy with how they look, I'm ready to move on to the next stage. So I have all of the paint on the model, and now I want to essentially ink all of these areas so it has a really nice shine and it really stands out and really pops. So here what I'm doing is I'm applying a red ink on the model, and I'm making sure that I'm going to be just having the brush essentially just paint directly over the line that we had just created. And using that technique that I was talking about with really controlling your fingers is key here, and I'm really making sure that once I am interacting with the ink on the model, that the ink will just stay on the area that I had painted and not flow over into anything else. So I'm just barely dipping the tip of the brush into the paint when I'm coming through and going onto these areas. Ink is by design supposed to be going into all the cracks and crevices on your model to kind of really highlight all those low areas. But what I'll typically use it for on most of my decals when they're custom is to really make the surface look a little bit more shiny, and I really want to give it a distinct look from the rest of the paint on the model. However, because it has that property of really flowing extremely well, basically just like water would flow on any surface, it is extremely important to know that if you apply too much ink onto a given area, it will flow right over and it will essentially ruin all of that detail. However, let's say you are painting with ink and you are able to act quickly and it does kind of flow over and you really are trying to fix it. Go ahead and just have like a little piece of paper towel ready, or you can even have a Q-tip and then just get it in there really quickly, and you can typically dab it. However, in this case, because it is a white border, I'm pretty confident that any paint that I would have had flow over would almost instantly ruin the model. And you can see here that I'm going back and applying another coat onto the red sword here so it becomes even more pronounced. So I would really recommend just making sure that you're being very meticulous with how you apply your paint. And now that I'm really happy with how those 2 swords have turned out, I'm going to move on to the black ink, and I'm going to be making sure that the black swords are also standing out and have that nice shine and luster to them. And initially when I'm putting the black ink onto this area, it's going fairly well. I'm being very controlled and trying to get it done. However, I'm going to show you here how I accidentally mess up in this area when I go back in for a second pass, because I was being very careful when I'm aligning the ink in here. But as you're going to see here, that I was trying to add just one more pass here, but unfortunately I added just a little bit too much ink, and you can see how the ink overflowed onto that area. So at this point I see that it's actually quite a bit of black ink, and I've messed it up. I'm going to try to use just the tip of the brush to draw it out, but I can see that it's ruined. So I'm going to come back in after it's dried and use some white paint, and I'm going to just hit that outer border of the sword and ensure that I can really tie that in and make sure that the lines are still clean. And you can see there I just barely had any paint on the tip of the brush, but all it took was just one quick swipe, and now everything's clean and even. And I'm going to move back over to the interacting blades, and I'm going to add the final bit of black ink here. I'm going to have the blade thicker than the hilt, just like we did on the red sword, and I'm going to make sure that I have a really nice luster where those two swords interact. And especially here, knowing that I had just messed up on that one knee pad, I really wanted to be careful on the tip of the sword because I really want to preserve and make sure that it has a nice point. And the hilt here, there's a lot of lines interacting. There's 4 lines that all come together, so I really want to make sure that I'm preserving these areas and also giving them a nice shine at the end. And then here is the final stage where I'm going in, and you can see that I'm just barely applying pressure. I just want to have the bristles do all the work and have the ink kind of leach in. So I'll actually do 2 quick passes where I don't even have any paint come off the brush, and then I'll finish with that 3rd pass, and I just am being patient enough to let the ink kind of leach out. And you can see here that I was able to apply that same principle over here on the red side of the sword once I had proven the concept out with the black ink on the other side. With that final brush stroke, I now have all of those areas highlighted, and I have all the little details of the swords called out, and we're done. The first contest winner actually wanted to remain anonymous, which I will fully respect, but I wanted to thank them for being so interactive, and we were able to go back and forth and come up with a design that they really liked. I'll be sure to post the rest of this series coming up very soon. I have the new settings for the mic fairly dialed in, and I'm going through the last little bit of footage, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how you guys like how this model turned out. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.